Hey, this is The Magic Prison by Elizabeth Harrison, Part 1. Little Harweda was born a prince. His father was king over a great land, and his mother was the most beautiful queen the world had ever seen. Prince Harweda was their only child. From the day of his birth, everything that love or money could do for him had been done. But his parents never thought of making the young prince care for anything but himself. He had never in all his life given up one of his comforts for that somebody else might have a pleasure. So of course he grew to be selfish, and by the time he was 5 years old he was so very disagreeable that nobody loved him. "Dear, dear, what shall we do?" said the poor queen mother, and the king only sighed and answered, "Ah, what indeed?" They were both very much grieved at heart, for they well knew that little Harweda, although he was a prince, would never grow up to be a really great king unless he could make his people love him. At last they decided to send for his fairy godmother to see if she could find a way to cure Prince Harweda of thinking of nothing but himself. "Well, well, well," exclaimed the godmother, when they had laid the case before her. "This is a pretty state of affairs, and I his godmother too. Why wasn't I called in sooner?" She told them that she would have to think a day and a night and another day before she could offer them any help. "But," she added, "if I take the child in charge, you must promise not to meddle for a whole year." The king and queen gladly promised that they would not speak to their son or even see him during that time if the fairy godmother would only cure him of his selfishness. "We'll see about that," said the godmother. "Humph! Expecting to be a king some day and not caring for anybody but himself. A fine king he'll make." With that, off she flew, and the king and queen saw nothing more of her for a day and a night and another day. Then back she came in a great hurry. "Give me the prince," she said. "I have his house all ready for him. 1 month from today I'll bring him back to you. Perhaps he'll be cured, and perhaps he won't. If he is not cured, then he shall try 2 months next time. We'll see." Without much ado, she picked up the astonished young prince and flew away with him as lightly as if he were nothing but a feather or a straw. They flew a long distance until they reached a great forest. In a minute more, the young prince was standing on a green grass beside a beautiful pink marble palace that looked somewhat like a good-sized summer house. "This is your home," said the godmother. "In it you will find everything you need, and you can do just as you choose with your time." Little Harweda was delighted at this, for there was nothing in the world he liked better than to do as he pleased. He tossed his cap up in the air and ran into the lovely little house without so much as saying thank you to his godmother. "Humph," she said as she disappeared. "You'll have enough of it before you are through, my fine prince," and she flew away. Part 2. Prince Harweda had no sooner stepped his foot inside the small, rose-colored palace than the iron door shut with a bang and locked itself. For you must know by this time that it was an enchanted house, as, of course, all houses are that are built by fairies. His fairy godmother had told him that it was his house, therefore he was interested in looking at everything in it. From the middle of the ceiling hung a large, gilded bird cage containing a beautiful bird, which just at this moment was singing a glad song of welcome to the prince. Harweda, however, cared very little about birds, so he took no notice of the songster. Wonderfully carved jars and vases of gold and silver stood above the floor, and each was filled with a different kind of perfume. "This is delicious," said Prince Harweda. "Now I can have all the sweet odors I want without the trouble of going out into the garden for flowers." In the center of the room was a fountain of sparkling water, which leapt back and forth, leapt up and fell back into the marble basin with a faint, dreamy music very pleasant to hear. On the table near at hand stood baskets of the most tempting pears and grapes and peaches, and near them were dishes of all kinds of sweetmeats. "Good!" cried the greedy young prince. "That is what I like best of all," and he fell to eating the fruit and sweetmeats as fast as he could cram them into his mouth. But, strange to say, no sooner did he reach his hand out for a soft melon pear or a rich juicy peach than another pear or peach took its place. After Prince Harweda had eaten until he could eat no more, he threw himself down on one of the couches and soon fell asleep. When he awoke, he noticed for the first time that the walls, which, by the way, were really the strangest part of the new home, they had in them 12 long checkered windows, which reached from the ceiling to the floor. The spaces between the windows were filled with mirrors exactly the same size as the windows, so that the whole room was walled in with windows and mirrors. Part 3. But little Prince Harweda scarcely glanced out the windows at all. He was so taken up with the broad, handsome mirrors, for in each of them he could see himself, and he was very fond of gazing at his reflection. He was much pleased when he noticed the mirrors were arranged so that he could see himself in several of them at the same time. He could thus see his front and back and each side all together. As he was a handsome boy, he enjoyed these many views of himself immensely. He spent so much time gazing into the wonderful mirrors that he had very little use for the books and games that had been placed there for him. He spent hours each day before first one mirror and then another, and he did not notice that the windows were growing narrower and the mirrors wider. In fact, the windows had become so small that they hardly admitted light enough for him to see himself in the mirrors. Still, this did not alarm him very much, as he cared nothing whatever for the outside world. The windows at last became mere slits in the wall, and the windows grew so large that they reflected not only little Harweda, but all of the room besides, in a dim kind of way. Finally, however, Prince Harweda awoke one morning and found himself in total darkness. Not a ray of light came from the outside, and of course, not an object in the room could be seen. He rubbed his eyes and sat up to make sure that he was not dreaming. Then he called loudly for someone to open a window for him, but no one came. He got up and felt his way to the iron door and tried to open it, but, as you know, it was locked. He kicked it, and he beat upon it, and he only bruised his fists and hurt his toes. He grew quite angry now. How dare anyone shut him, a prince, in a dark prison like this? He cried out against his fairy godmother, calling her all sorts of horrid names. Then he blamed his father and mother. In fact, he blamed everyone and everything but himself. But it was no use. The sound of his own voice was his only answer. The whole of the outside world seemed to have forgotten him. As he felt his way back to the couch, he knocked over one of the golden jars that had held the liquid perfume. The odor was all gone now, and only an empty jar rolled over the floor. He laid himself down on the couch, but its soft pillows had been removed, and the iron framework received him instead. He was dismayed, and lay for a long time trying to think what he had best to do with himself. All before him was blank darkness, as black as the darkest night you ever saw. He reached out his hand to get some fruit to eat, but only 1 or 2 withered apples remained on the table. Was he to starve to death? Suddenly he noticed that the twinkling music of the fountain had ceased. He hastily felt his way over to it and found in place of the dancing, running stream, a silent pool of water. A hush had fallen upon everything about him. A dead silence was in the room. He threw himself down upon the floor and wished that he were dead too. At last he heard, or thought he heard, a faint sound. He listened eagerly. It seemed to be some tiny creature not far from him trying to move about. For the first time for nearly a month he remembered the bird in its gilded cage. "Poor little thing," he cried as he sprang up. "You too are shut within this terrible prison. This thick darkness must be as hard for you to bear as it is for me." He went toward the cage, and as he came near, the bird gave a sad little chirp. "You must need some water to drink, poor thing," he said, filling its drinking cup. "This is all I have to give you." Just then he heard a harsh, grating sound, as of rusty bolts sliding with difficulty out of their sockets, and then faint rays of light, not wider than a hair, began to shine between the heavy mirrors. Prince Harweda was filled with joy. Perhaps, said he softly, "I may yet see the light again. Ah, how beautiful the outside world would look to me now. The next day he was so hungry that he began to eat one of the old withered apples, and as he bit it, it thought of the bird, his fellow prisoner. "You must be hungry, too, poor little thing," he said, putting part of the apple in the bird's cage. Again came the harsh, grating sound, and the boy noticed the cracks of light were growing larger. Still, they were only cracks. Nothing of the outside world could be seen. But it was a comfort not to have to feel his way about in the total darkness. Prince Harweda went up to one of the cracks and put his eye close to it, as he would to a pinhole in a paper. Was glad to find that he could tell the greenness of the grass from the blue of the sky. Then he climbed up into a chair and unfastened the bird cage from the golden chain by which it hung. He carried it carefully to the nearest crack of light and placed it close to the narrow opening. Once more he heard the harsh, grating sound, and the wall moved a bit. The windows were now at least an inch wide. At this, the poor prince clasped his hands with delight. He sat down near the bird cage and gazed out the narrow opening. Never before had the trees looked so tall and stately, or the white clouds floating through the sky so lovely. The next day, as he was carefully cleaning the bird's cage, the walls again creaked and groaned, and the mirrors grew narrower as the windows widened. But Prince Harweda saw only the flood of sunshine that poured in and the beauty of the larger landscape. He cared nothing whatever now for the stupid mirrors, which could only reflect what was placed before them. One day, as two white doves suddenly soared aloft in the blue sky, the poor little bird, who had now become the prince's comrade, gave a pitiful little trill. "Dear little fellow," said Prince Harweda, "do you also long for your freedom? You shall at least be as free as I am." So saying, he opened the cage door, and the bird flew out. One day, soon after this, the little bird fluttered up against the window pane and beat his wings against it in a vain effort to get out. A new idea seized the young prince. He took up a golden jar, went to the window, and struck on it one of the checkered panes of glass with all his force. "You shall be free, even if I cannot be," he said to the bird. 2 or 3 strong blows shivered the small pane, and the bird swept out into the free air beyond. "Ah, my pretty one, how glad I am that you are free at last," cried the prince, watching the flight of his fellow prisoner. His face was bright with glad, unselfish joy. The small pink marble palace shook from top to bottom. The iron door flew open, and the fresh wind from the sea rushed in. Prince Harweda could hardly believe his eyes as he sprang to the door. There stood his fairy godmother, smiling, with her hand stretched out to him. "Come, my godchild," she said gently. "We will now go back to your father and mother, the king and queen." Great indeed was the rejoicing in the palace when the Prince Harweda was returned to them a changed boy, kind and thoughtful to all about him. Many a struggle he had with himself and his old habit of selfishness, but as time passed by, he grew to be a great and wise king, tenderly caring for all his people and loved by them in return.